Hello, everyone. Welcome to Joe the Lawyer. I'm your host, Joe Pometto. Today, we're going to look at an article from the Washington Post. As homicides soar nationwide, mayors see few options for gaining control. And one of the reasons I'm covering this is because if you saw my last video, I did an analysis on broken windows, the broken windows theory of crime reduction, and also some of the criminal justice reform that is currently taking place, in seeing if criminal justice reform kind of chips away at broken windows. Does that lead to an increase in crime? This is an interesting take here. Perhaps it does, perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps it's partially responsible. But I'm gonna jump through this article and add my opinions throughout. This was published just a few hours ago, so it's a June 22nd article out of the Washington Post. If you like my content, I'm Joe Pometto, Joe the Lawyer. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. Also sign up for my email list. You'll get a free PDF on what to do when you're pulled over by the police. So this article starts, the killings rolled over the country like a fast-moving storm. From Savannah to Austin, from Chicago to Cleveland, in 6 hours one night this month, 4 mass shooting attacks. Has anybody else noticed that the media has started to refer to shootings more often as mass shootings, whereas in the past that wasn't always the case. Mass shooting was sort of reserved for something like the Las Vegas shooter who shot like 48 or so people. Now the media is using it. They're labeling pretty much any killing that sees, I believe, more than 2 or 3 people, whether it be gun or gang related, as mass shootings. So they're sort of expanding the definition of that as far as how people normally think about it. And in their wake, a sober recognition from city leaders that they don't have many options left for curbing a surge in homicides that is traumatizing communities nationwide. And we see here a memorial at a home in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago where several of this gentleman's close friends were killed in a shooting on June 17th. We have done almost all we can do, said Van Johnson, the mayor of Savannah, Georgia. The tools for fighting back are limited without state and federal help, said Austin Mayor Steve Adler. By the way, Savannah, Georgia, awesome city. Awesome city. Visit if you get a chance. It's going to get worse, Cleveland Mayor Frank Jackson, Democrat, said. As the homicide rate climbed through a year of pandemic-imposed shutdowns and civil unrest, officials held firm to their belief that the rise was driven by that exceptional set of circumstances. As life returned to normal, the theory went the killings would slow. But even as coronavirus restrictions have been lifted and protests have quieted in recent months, the violence has not subsided. Indeed, it has continued to grow, and now local leaders are grappling with a possibility they had long feared, that a decades-long era of declining murder rates in America's cities may be over, and the increased killings may be here to stay. There's nothing, said Jackson, that's going to bring this down in the near future. Officials and criminal justice experts offer abundant reasons. A nation awash in guns, now more than ever. Deep mistrust between police departments and the communities they serve, particularly in high-poverty areas. The still painful stresses caused or exacerbated by the pandemic, a cycle of violence that, once set in motion, is hard to break. The thing about violence is that it builds on itself, it cascades. Princeton sociologist Patrick Sharkey said, each shooting brings the possibility of a reprisal. I agree with that. While the causes may be known, or at least theorized, the solutions are more contested. Even now, there was widespread disagreement over why the homicide rate fell for so long. How to bring it back down has become a subject of vigorous debate, with the issue taking center stage in Tuesday's New York mayoral primary and offering yet another flashpoint in the country's partisan divide. And if you haven't been following the race in New York, Andrew Yang is one of the front runners, and he's running against a gentleman, I believe his name is Eric Arnold, don't quote me on the last name, who's a former police officer. So it's Andrew Yang squared off against a former police officer. Very interesting, very, very interesting race. It will be fascinating to see who wins. Democrats almost universally say tighter gun laws are needed to curb violent crime, along with investments in education and jobs programs to reduce historic inequities. Guns and poverty are the two outliers that we have compared to other countries, said Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher, whose city saw a near doubling of homicide rates last year. There are just guns everywhere. But new gun restrictions are a non-starter in Washington, where Republicans have blocked repeated efforts, and in many GOP-controlled state legislatures, the laws have been loosened this year. Republicans, along with many police unions and some chiefs, say the real cause of the spike in killings has been an overzealous criminal justice reform movement that has devastated morale in departments and allowed too many criminals to go free. Nowhere do you see recognition that there are some people who cause incredible harm to the community and who unfortunately need to be in jail, said Bill Bratton, a former police commissioner in New York, LA, and Boston. The argument that reforms are to blame for the increase in homicides doesn't hold water, said the Reverend Mary Emma White Hammond, a pastor and activist in Boston, which saw homicides rise last year but decline so far in 2021. People don't wake up and go, you know what, I'm going to shoot you because of police reform, said White Hammond, who is also the city's top environmental official but spoke only in her capacity as a pastor and activist. If you know young people who are engaged in the world, they're not emboldened because of police reform. Putting reforms in place could lead to a period of transition that is tough as officials figure out how to change things, she said. But the solution, White Hammond said, is to lean in and do the work to figure out how we're going to shift, rather than being half-hearted and coming up with excuses to leave in place a system that doesn't work, that takes people's lives unnecessarily. I don't believe that police reform motivates anybody to perhaps go out and commit crimes and or commit homicide. But I do personally think that the criticism that the police have come under in the last 2 years may be causing them to have low morale and to do less of the real investigative work that can lead to arrests that prevent homicides. For instance, if you watched my last video, there was a community in California that is going to cut down on the ability of police to make traffic stops in certain instances. Now, you may be for that, you may not be for that. That aside, and the invasion of any right aside there, okay, the police use traffic stops. Oftentimes, as a result of a traffic stop, they will discover illegal guns or illegal drugs. And they can get guns and drugs and the individuals who may potentially commit crimes off the street. That can therefore lower a homicide rate. Now, that has nothing to do with the reaction to police reform. But if the police are not performing their job, doing the same proactive investigating and or arresting, I do believe that can lead to an increase in crime. Is that what you're saying? She said of people linking reforms to the rise in killings. We should just leave in place a broken system because fixing it will be messy in the short term. And I agree with her. I do believe that there is much criminal justice reform work that should be done. I do. And it could lead to some pain in the short term. But I think there's a way to do it while still keeping people safe. Bratton, who helped pioneer the broken windows theory of policing, in which even petty violations are punished to prevent more serious crime, had long posited that widespread urban violence could be kept at bay almost indefinitely. By his own admission, the past year has proven him wrong. New York City police reported 462 homicides last year, up from 319 the previous year. Police in Phoenix said 200 homicides last year, up from 139. In Philadelphia, 499 homicides, up from 356 a year earlier. The question is, though, are the police departments still engaged in broken windows? So you can't say that broken windows isn't working if they're not actually doing it, just because they did it in the past. I don't know the answer to that. In the first quarter of 2021, homicides were up over the same period last year in several cities, including Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Indianapolis, Orlando, Pittsburgh, my hometown, and Tampa Bay, according to data collected from the Chiefs Association. The violence has extended into the summer. In Philadelphia, homicides and shootings are both already ahead of last year. As of June 13th, 238, up from 179 last year, along with more than 1,600 shootings, up from more than 1,300. In New York, 181 slayings as of June 6, up from 162 last year, 687 shootings, up from 109. LA, 148 homicides, up from 121 in 2020. The rise in homicides has not been accompanied by an increase in other crimes. This is perhaps the most fascinating fact. Quite the contrary, other crime actually fell nationwide last year, said Asher, who was previously a crime analyst for the New Orleans police. There are far more property crimes than violent crimes each year, and homicides account for a small fraction of all violent crimes. So the surge in homicides had virtually no impact on the nation's crime rate, the overall crime rate. The story is very much the specific increase in murder. The vast majority of murders are coming from guns these days. While some commentators have sought to link the increase in killings to the demonstrations that followed George Floyd's murder and the push to cut police funding, Asher said there was no relationship between places with the heaviest protests and the largest increase in homicides. Homicides and shootings were already up in several cities, including New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, among others, before Floyd's death. Asher also found no connection between the increase in homicides and police funding, with little difference in the rise in bloodshed, regardless of whether a city's police budget rose or fell. The increase is also not localized in big cities, but is extending to cities of every size. Given how widespread it was, it suggests there was a big national thing that drove it, or more likely, big national things that drove it. And I agree with that. You know, often large societal changes like this are not due to a single thing. It's usually a couple of complicated factors. Experts and law enforcement officials alike point first to the flood of guns on American streets. Gun sales swelled last year, particularly in the spring, as the pandemic took hold, and then in the summer after nationwide protests. The increase in people buying guns continued into the start of this year. The sheer ubiquity of guns, said Brianna Fox, an associate professor of criminology, facilitates impulsive decision-making. Somebody who could have been able to calm down, walk away, and make a better choice 30 minutes later now has access to a gun and can use it in a very destructive way. I think what we really should be doing then is for the arrests or the percentage of these crimes that are solved, we should look at the source of the guns. Were they recently purchased weapons? Were they stolen? I bet a lot of the time, most of the time, guns used in killings were stolen. In some cases, there have been some positive glimmers even amid the anguish. In Chicago, homicides were up by the end of May over the same period last year, but the pace had slowed, with slayings in both April and May down from the same months last year. In Madison, Wisconsin, homicides are down so far this year, but shootings have increased. Easy access to firearms is a major issue, especially in the Midwest, said Chief Sean F. Barnes. Barnes said the people committing acts of violence in his community are notably younger than in the past. And he said for these people, shootings are seen as a way to gain instant credibility among their peers. I must say, and this is anecdotal, but just watching the local news, I agree with this chief that it has been young people committing these shootings. I see more young shootings here in Pittsburgh. Police leaders are discussing the surge in bloodshed with each other, comparing notes as they try to confront the issue. In 2020, Fort Worth had more than 100 homicides in a single year for the first time in 25 years. This year, he said, The city is already ahead of last year's pace. It really comes down to people who just unfortunately have their hands on guns that shouldn't. To confront the ongoing bloodshed, Noakes said, officials need to take a different approach than they might have in the past and collaborate more with communities that are struggling. We're not going to arrest our way out of the problem, he said. That's particularly true at a time when the legal system in many parts of the country remains inundated by prosecutions after the extended shutdown of the courts because of the pandemic. Nancy O'Malley, district attorney in the California county that includes Oakland, said she has a 12,000 case backlog with no realistic prospect of clearing it. We're just dismissing because we know we won't see a courtroom. Those dismissals come after a year in which lawmakers prioritized keeping people out of jails so that overcrowded conditions did not exacerbate the spread of the virus. With bail rules relaxed under emergency orders, people arrested on weapons and other charges were free to roam. I think that's definitely a factor. And look, the increase in gun sales is likely a factor as well. I think we really need to look hard at statistics to parse this out and to see what really had an impact, so we know, so our society knows where to attack in order to fix these things. However, I don't think that, a crowded case backlog is any reason not to prosecute homicides, okay, or to arrest people with guns, etc., etc., because the most serious cases can still take priority. If they're talking about arresting for very small things in the broken windows theory, okay, then there's a valid argument there because it's going to be harder to jam people up over very small things when you have such a huge case backlog. But the police need to continue, and law enforcement needs to continue to search for illegal guns, get them off the streets, and arrest the people who possess them. There was basically no consequence, O'Malley said. We saw some people who were released for low-level crimes come back and commit higher-level crimes. Those included murder. Oakland had 102 homicides last year, up from 75 the year before. The pace of killings this year is even faster. There haven't been many cars on the road or people on the street, so it's been open warfare for those who have guns who want to shoot at each other, she said. And, that's a thought that I had as well. Without as much general traffic on the street, even perhaps less police patrols, but just a lower presence of people could lead to a person thinking it's more likely, number one, that they could shoot the person that they wanted to shoot, and number two, that they would not be seen and they could get away with it. O'Malley said she sees signs that the murder rate are beginning to level off as California opens up. Let's hope. Maybe that's a big factor. Many of the crimes have involved informal gangs, and they have been concentrated in high poverty neighborhoods. Homicides have also extended to unlikely places, rural parts of the country where killings had not long ago been a rarity. Now, that's very interesting, and it makes you think that perhaps the pandemic had a much greater role in this than we can imagine. In Miami as well, Mayor Francis Suarez said he's cautiously optimistic. The city had 22 murders as of the middle of June, a pace that would put Miami below the 67 recorded last year. The economy bouncing back from the pandemic has been helpful. The activity has been helpful. So maybe that's the key here. The decrease in activity caused the murder rate to go up. It's extremely fascinating. It's hard to say. Also making a difference, he said, last year the police dedicated 200,000 hours to the city's coronavirus response. A total he thinks will be substantially lower this year. So, the police were distracted. In other cities, homicide rates have continued to rise, and mayors have been crying out for help, especially from Washington. After 4 cities experienced mass shootings within 6 hours of each other on the night of June 11th, 27 mayors wrote to President Biden to demand he press Congress for action on gun legislation. Half a dozen mayors, including the leaders in Savannah, Austin, and Chicago, told reporters that the need for action was urgent. Wake up, said Dayton Mayor Nan Whaley, president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We cannot stop gun violence without common sense changes to our gun laws. But the mayors, all Democrats, also acknowledged action was likely to be blocked by Republicans in Congress who say new restrictions infringe on Second Amendment rights. Even without congressional action, Chicago mayor said Lori Lightfoot said Biden admin can use the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to step up its oversight of gun dealers. The Justice Department on Tuesday announced plans to roll out 5 strike forces targeting gun trafficking. DOJ said as part of the plan, federal and local officials would target what it called significant trafficking corridors in New York, Chicago, LA, Washington, D.C., and the Bay Area. That sounds like a great idea. We shouldn't, illegal gun trafficking needs to be shut down. Bratton, too, said there are steps Washington can take, including establishing a National Commission on Crime to develop guidelines for best practices in policing. We're not going to solve this on a city-by-city basis, the former commissioner said. Sharkey, sociologist, said neighborhood by neighborhood might be more like it. Police, he said, have had to step back after community outrage over brutal and racist tactics, with violent crime creeping into the void. Police leaders say officers might be pulling back in some cases, fearing backlash or controversy, but other experts said they were skeptical depolicing was leading to the rise in killings. Still, the environment could change if community leaders and groups start to fill that space with mentorship and job programs. All are initiatives that have been proven to work in reducing crime. Police dominating by any means necessary is not sustainable. We need a new model. A favorite quote of mine that I've heard on the radio is, if you put a paycheck in someone's hand, you might take the gun out of it, right? The best way to get a gun out of someone's hands is to put a paycheck in their hands. To me, this looks like a multi-level problem here. Frankly, I do think that that depolicing has played a role, but I think the availability of firearms has also played a role. I think the pandemic has played a large role, taking people off the streets, leading to perhaps like a killing fields effect where people may feel like they can get away with homicide and or there aren't as many people on the street, so they have, they can take a shot. And plus just the general stress of the pandemic. So maybe if and when the economy bounces back, we'll see a natural decrease. But it's going to be interesting. I don't think we're going to find one trigger point. But if we can attack perhaps all of these issues as a society, we can bring that level back down. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'm Joe Pometto, Joe the Lawyer. Hope you enjoyed and found this interesting. I'm going to continue to track this because I do find homicide rates to be fascinating. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. All right, everybody, have a great day. Joe the Lawyer out.